Welcome, fellow ecologists, to Chapter 6, Water Relations. During this chapter, I'll be talking about how water moves through various ecosystems and its availability in the air, and also how both plants and animals use water and conserve water and acquire water, both on land and in the aquatic environment. We'll be looking at streams and lakes and the ocean as well. Your previous studies in chemistry and biology have taught you that water tends to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and we call that moving down the concentration gradient. And what we'll be looking at in this chapter is how animals gain and lose water depending on the type of microclimate that they live in. One of the main ways that animals tend to lose water when they're living on land is through evaporation. It's especially the case if they live in an area that has very little water vapor, such as Tucson, Arizona, for example. If you go out for a run in Tucson, you'll lose a lot more water than if you're running in Milwaukee. And the reason for that is that the water concentration difference between your body and the air in Tucson, Arizona is much greater than that difference that you would find if you were running in Milwaukee. The amount of water vapor in the air we call relative humidity, and it's calculated by determining the existing water vapor density and dividing that through by the total amount of water vapor that the air could possibly hold. This is called a saturation water vapor density, and it's greater as the temperature increases. That's why when we were talking about the tropics at the very beginning of our lectures, and we said as the air rises and cools, it tends to rain. That's because the cooler air can't hold as much water. Another way of thinking about the amount of vapor in the atmosphere is in terms of pressure. There's a total atmospheric pressure that's made up of all the gases in the air, and water vapor is one of those gases. And so if you look at the difference between the existing water vapor pressure and what the water vapor pressure would be if the air was totally saturated with water vapor, it had as much as it possibly could hold, then that difference between saturation and the current vapor pressure would be a vapor pressure deficit. And knowing that would allow us to determine whether animals or plants would readily be losing water to the atmosphere or not. As I mentioned earlier, water tends to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, or down its concentration gradient. And water in freshwater or fresh water is more concentrated than ocean water. That's because fresh water has less salt, and the salt takes up space. So if we have an organism that's in fresh water, they tend to take water on because they're like a cell with this semi-permeable membrane around it, and there's more water on the outside than on the inside, so water tends to move across that membrane into the organism. This movement of water through the semi-permeable membrane is diffusion, and in the case of water movement, we call it osmosis. Generally speaking, there are three environments that aquatic organisms live in. We refer to them as isoosmotic, hypoosmotic, and hyperosmotic. And these get confusing sometimes. We can refer to isoosmotic as having the same concentration of water and salt inside the body as outside the body. Now, hypoosmotic, hypo refers to under, like hypodermic needle, and we're referring to the amount of salt or solute inside the body as being under that which is outside the body. So if there is less salt inside the body, then there's going to be more water. And you see here in the definition it says body fluids are higher at a higher concentration inside the body than the external environment. In a hyperosmotic situation, that means that the salt concentration or solute concentration inside the body is higher, hyper, like a hyperactive child. And so the amount of fluid or water inside is lower, and they tend to take on water from the external environment. In the diagram, you can see that a fish in fresh water would be called hyperosmotic, and it tends to take water in because it has less water in its body than the surrounding fresh water. And so the concentration of water is higher outside its body than inside its body, so the water tends to move in across its membranes, and it actually tends to lose salt. So it has to actively keep salts in and actively get rid of excess water constantly. Whereas a fish in salt water, which is hypoosmotic, or it has less salt in its body than the surrounding water, it's losing water and actually dehydrates in that seawater. So it has to actively bring water in and find ways to remove salt. Now we shift gears a little bit and talk about water movement between the soil and the roots of plants. And in this case, we talk about the water potential gradient. Water potential is given the designation, the Greek letter psi, and it depends on the concentration of a solute in the water. So pure water has a psi of 0, and if there is salt or some solute mixed in with the water, then it has some number less than 0. And the more solute there is, the bigger that number is, that is, the more negative it is. So when we consider a diagram of a tree and we look at the psi of soil water, we see that it's closer to 0 than the psi of the water in the tree, and as you go further up, the numbers become more and more negative. This means that there's more solute in the water at the top of the tree than at the bottom of the tree. So again, thinking of our idea of water moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, the water moves from the soil, where the psi is closer to 0. Remember, 0 is pure water. And then the water moves up into the trunk of the tree, where the psi number is more negative, and it moves right up the tree because it's moving down its concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The movement of water in plants gets even more interesting when we add in addition to the psi of the solute, we have a psi associated with matrix forces, which is the tendency of water to stick to the side of a container. And this is what causes water to move up in a straw above the level inside of a glass. And then we have the psi associated with pressure, which is the pull that's exerted when water evaporates from the leaves. This pulling or negative pressure results from the hydrogen bonding between water molecules, so that when a water molecule evaporates into the atmosphere, it tends to pull the next molecule out of the leaf of the plant, and then so you have something like a string just pulling the water up. So you have all three of these psi forces working together in order to move the water through the plant. So when we consider creatures that live on the land and think about their water situation, they're really facing two major issues. One is the loss of water through the process of evaporation, and then the other is how do they replace that water that they've lost. We can think of this in terms of a formula, and this kind of brings all of the different components of water issues for animals on the land. It just kind of brings them together. The water that is inside an animal, WIA, is really based upon how much they can drink, the food that they eat, and this food provides water in two ways: the actual water content of the food, and also the process of metabolizing the food produces some water as well. And then how much water can they possibly absorb from the vapor that's in the air? And then that's balanced by evaporation, so the amount of water that an animal actually evaporates to its surrounding environment, and then the water that it loses by things like urination and excretion and sweating. In plants, it's a little bit simpler. The water in plants is a result of how much water can be taken up by the roots and how much water the plant can absorb from the vapor that's in the air, and that's balanced against the transpiration or the movement of water out of the plant, like we discussed when we were talking about psi, and also the amount of water that is secreted. Sometimes if you park your car underneath a tree, you'll find sap on your car, and those are secretions that have occurred from the leaves of the tree. So going back to animals now, when we think about how animals actually take in water, it's basically drinking and through eating food. I mentioned that food had the two components. One was the actual water that's in the food, but when an animal breaks down food, it certainly gets energy from that, but the waste products of the breakdown of glucose, as you see here in the formula, is carbon dioxide and water. We call this metabolic water, and that can be a very significant component of the water intake for some animals. Water intake by plants is interesting in that they tend to develop deeper roots and more roots in areas where there isn't as much water available. For example, if you water your lawn artificially on a regular basis, the roots won't grow as deep, and then if you are forced into a situation like a water conservation requirement by the local government and you can't water your lawn anymore, then your lawn will tend to dry up before other lawns that haven't been watered artificially on a regular basis. And that's similar to what Park found in his studies of Japanese grasses. Plants and animals have a variety of ways that they tend to conserve water, living in on a land environment or terrestrial environment. They may be covered with some sort of waterproofing, or they may reduce the amount of urine that they produce or feces. They may even have a long series of channels that the air that they're breathing out goes through, so that that air will be cooled and some of the water vapor in there will condense before they actually lose it. They may change their behavior, Like some animals may hide under rocks during the day and go out at night in order to feed to avoid water loss. Trees and other plants during the dry season may drop their leaves, or they may have very thick leaves with very few openings or stomata in them. And some plants and animals may even go through a whole number of weeks or months in which they're totally dormant. And they may not move very much or grow very much during that time period. Your book provides an interesting example of how two different organisms handle the desert environment. Camels and the saguaro cactus. The camel is a fascinating creature. Here it has very thick hair that isn't used so much to keep the body warm, but actually lowers the body temperature so that it's not absorbing so much heat. And then when it sits down, it faces into the sun so that it reduces the amount of body surface that's actually exposed to the sun. And also, if you try and move a camel, it's very difficult to pull them up because they don't want to get up and then have to sit down on another patch of hot sand and cool that down. They also have very long loops of Henle in their kidneys, which reduces the amount of water that they excrete. And they can hold quite a bit of water in their tissues as well. Whereas the saguaro cactus has a very large round trunk, and it's able to store a lot of water in the trunk and also in the arms of the plant. It doesn't have the typical leaves that would lose water to the environment. And when you look at the trunk itself, it's shaped in such a way that it would reflect a lot of the sun's rays. And the surface of the trunk and the arms of the saguaro are very waxy, so that it reduces the amount of evaporative loss. Two other creatures that live in the desert have different ways of dealing with the water loss that they face. The scorpions tend not to move around very much at all during the day. They do their hunting at night, and they have very low metabolic rates so that they don't have to go out and capture food very often. Whereas the cicadas are active during the warmest part of the day, but they're actually taking the liquid from the plants and running it through their body and going through an evaporative cooling process that reduces their body temperature and allows them to continue living and feeding even during the warmest part of the day. Organisms in the aquatic environment have different ways of conserving water. The sharks, skates, and rays actually increase the solute concentration in their bodies by retaining some of the salts that are in their urine, and then they become slightly hyperosmotic to the seawater so that water moves into their body. The marine bony fishes, on the other hand, are losing water to the surrounding environment, and so they have to drink the seawater. They end up with excess salt then in their system, and they have to have ways of getting rid of that. Some of them have some special cells associated with their gills that will actively transport the salt out of their circulatory system. And then they also remove some of the salt through the kidneys, and they have very concentrated urine. Freshwater fish, on the other hand, are constantly taking on water, so their problem is getting rid of the excess water, and so they have very, very dilute urine, and they're constantly urinating in order to eliminate that excess water. But then they have to replace the salts in their body because they're losing that, so they absorb salts by special cells in their gill filaments that are actually transporting salt from the surrounding environment into their bodies. And they also get salt from the food that they eat. So the take-home message then from this chapter is that animals and plants that live on the land have to struggle in a variety of ways to find water and find ways to take that water up and then to limit how much they lose to the surrounding environment. And then animals that live in the water, if they live in fresh water, they are faced with a situation of being flooded by water all the time, and they have to find ways to eliminate that water. So both animals and plants are balancing their salt and water concentrations in order to survive in a fairly harsh environment.